Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Library. Tonight, we're going to explore the quiet, wonderful world of mushrooms. Not the grocery store kind, though those are part of our story too. We're going to wander through forests, both ancient and modern, peek beneath fallen logs, and discover a kingdom of life that exists mostly out of sight, working its magic in the soil, in the shadows, and sometimes in the most unexpected places. Mushrooms are more than just curious little umbrella shapes poking through the forest floor. They're the visible tips of vast, hidden organisms that connect trees, break down the old to make way for the new, and have been shaping life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. They're neither plant nor animal, but something entirely their own. Something ancient, something quietly essential. So settle in. Let your mind wander with us into the underground networks, the glowing forests, and the microscopic mysteries of fungi. This is a gentle journey, meant to ease you into rest, while filling your thoughts with the kind of wonder that makes the world feel a little more magical, a little more interconnected, and a lot more fascinating than we usually give it credit for. Let's start with a simple question that doesn't have such a simple answer. What exactly is a mushroom? What is a fungus? For most of human history, people lumped fungi in with plants. They grow from the ground, they don't move around, they must be plants, right? But scientists eventually realized that fungi are something completely different. They belong to their own kingdom of life, as distinct from plants as they are from animals. Here's something that might surprise you. Fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Yes, really. If you were to draw a family tree of all living things, you'd find that fungi and animals branch off from a common ancestor that lived over 1 billion years ago, long after plants had already gone their own evolutionary way. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That a mushroom sitting silently on a log has more in common, genetically speaking, with you than it does with the moss growing beside it. So what makes a fungus a fungus? Well, unlike plants, fungi don't have chlorophyll, that green pigment that allows plants to turn sunlight into food through photosynthesis. Fungi can't make their own food from sunlight and air. Instead, they have to get their energy and nutrients from other sources, much like animals do. But the way they eat is uniquely their own. Imagine if you could secrete your digestive enzymes out into the world around you, breaking down your food externally before absorbing the nutrients. That's exactly what fungi do. They release powerful enzymes into their environment, enzymes that can break down even the toughest materials like wood and fallen leaves, turning them into simpler compounds that the fungus can then absorb. It's digestion in reverse. Instead of bringing food inside to digest it, fungi digest their food outside and then bring the nutrients in. These enzymes are remarkably powerful. They can break down cellulose, the structural component that makes up plant cell walls. They can break down lignin, the compound that makes wood hard and resistant to decay. Some fungi can even break down keratin, the protein in hair and feathers, or chitin, the material in insect exoskeletons. Different fungi specialize in breaking down different materials, and this specialization allows them to occupy different ecological niches. The ability to digest externally gives fungi a unique advantage. They don't need a mouth or a digestive system. They don't need to move to find food. They simply grow toward wherever food is available, secreting enzymes as they go, and absorbing the results of that external digestion through their cell walls. It's an elegant, efficient system that has served fungi well for hundreds of millions of years. This external digestion also means that fungi are incredibly important for nutrient cycling. When they break down dead organic matter, they release nutrients back into the environment in forms that other organisms can use. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all the elements that were locked up in dead tissue are freed and made available again. Without fungi performing this constant work of decomposition, nutrients would become trapped in dead material, and the living world would gradually grind to a halt. The body of a fungus is made up of tiny thread-like structures called hyphae. Each hypha is incredibly thin, usually just 4 to 6 micrometers in diameter. That's about 1/10 of the width of a human hair. If you could see an individual hypha with your naked eye, it would appear as fine as a spider's silk, almost invisible against the soil or wood where it grows. These hyphae grow at their tips, branching and rebranching as they spread through soil, wood, or whatever substrate the fungus is growing on. Imagine watching time-lapse photography of mycelial growth. You'd see the tips extending, probing in different directions, some branches growing faster than others, the whole network expanding in a kind of pulsing, flowing motion. It's alive, responsive, constantly adapting to its environment. They form a network, a web of fine filaments that we call the mycelium. This network is the essence of the fungus, the part that truly lives and grows and feeds. In some species, the hyphae are separated by internal walls called septa, which divide the long tubes into individual cells. In others, the hyphae are coenocytic, meaning they have no dividing walls, and the entire network is essentially one long continuous cell, with many nuclei flowing through it like a living river. The mycelium is the real body of the fungus. It's usually hidden underground or inside dead wood, spreading out in all directions, searching for nutrients. Some mycelia are small, barely visible to the naked eye. Others are enormous. In fact, some of the largest organisms on Earth are fungi. There's a honey fungus in Oregon, an Armillaria ostoi, whose mycelium covers more than 2,000 acres of forest floor. It's been growing for thousands of years, quietly spreading through the soil, connecting with tree roots, breaking down dead wood. You could walk through that forest and never realize you were standing on top of a single, vast organism. When conditions are right, when there's enough moisture and the temperature is favorable, the mycelium produces what we think of as mushrooms. But here's the thing. The mushroom, that cap and stem we see above ground, is not the fungus itself. It's just the fruiting body, the reproductive structure. Think of it like an apple on a tree. The tree is the main organism, living year after year. The apple is just there to spread seeds. Similarly, the mycelium is the main organism, and the mushroom is there to spread spores, the fungal equivalent of seeds. Fungi have cell walls like plants do, but theirs are made of chitin, the same tough material that forms the exoskeletons of insects and the shells of crabs. This is another clue to their relationship with animals. While plants build their cell walls from cellulose, fungi and animals both use molecules that are nitrogen-based. It's one of many small details that reveal the ancient connection between fungi and the animal kingdom. Fungi also store energy as glycogen, just like animals do, rather than as starch like plants. These might seem like tiny biochemical details, but they tell a bigger story about the tree of life and how different branches evolved their own solutions to survival. When you look at the molecular machinery inside cells, the genes that code for proteins, the metabolic pathways that process energy, you can see the ancient relationships between different groups of organisms. The diversity of fungi is staggering. Scientists have described about 120,000 species of fungi, but this is likely just a small fraction of the total. Some estimates suggest there may be millions of fungal species on Earth, most still unknown to science. They live in every habitat imaginable, in soils and on plants, in fresh water and salt water, in extreme environments like the Arctic and deep underground, even in the human body as part of our natural microbiome. Some fungi are microscopic, visible only under a microscope. Others produce fruiting bodies that can weigh many pounds. Some live for just a few days, while others, like the massive mycelial networks we mentioned earlier, can live for thousands of years. They can be colorful or drab, beautiful or bizarre, helpful or harmful. What unites them all is that fundamental fungal nature. They're heterotrophs that digest externally. They're built from hyphae and mycelia. They reproduce through spores, and they play essential roles in ecosystems as decomposers, parasites, and partners. Understanding these basic characteristics helps us appreciate just how important fungi are, and how different they are from both the plants and animals we're more familiar with. So, to sum it up, fungi are organisms that lack chlorophyll, can't photosynthesize, digest their food externally using enzymes, and are built from networks of hyphae that form mycelia. They're decomposers, parasites, and partners. They're ancient and everywhere, and they're absolutely essential to life as we know it. And perhaps most importantly, they're endlessly fascinating, full of mysteries we're still unraveling, connections we're still discovering, and wonders we're still learning to appreciate. Fungi wear many hats in the natural world. They're the cleanup crew, the partners, the parasites, and sometimes the builders. Let's explore each of these roles, because understanding what fungi do helps us appreciate just how deeply woven they are into the fabric of ecosystems. First and foremost, fungi are decomposers. When a tree falls in a forest, when leaves drop to the ground in autumn, when an animal passes away, fungi are often the first responders. They move in with their enzymes and begin the slow, patient work of breaking down complex organic matter into simpler compounds. This isn't just cleanup, it's recycling on a grand scale. Fungi release nutrients that have been locked up in tissue that has stopped living, making them available again for plants to use. Without fungi, material that has stopped growing would pile up endlessly, and essential nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus would become trapped, unavailable to living organisms. Think about a fallen log in a forest. When it first falls, it's hard and solid, covered in bark. But over the years, something remarkable happens. The log softens and crumbles, its surface becoming textured and uneven. Moss begins to grow on it. Ferns take root in the crumbly wood. Seedlings sprout from its surface, their roots finding nutrition in the decaying material. Eventually, the log will be gone entirely, transformed into soil and humus and living plants. That transformation is largely the work of fungi. They break down lignin, the tough, structural component of wood that gives trees their strength and rigidity. Very few organisms can digest lignin effectively. Bacteria struggle with it. Most insects can't touch it. But certain fungi, particularly white rot and brown rot fungi, have evolved enzymes specifically for the job. White rot fungi can completely break down both lignin and cellulose, leaving behind a soft, pale, fibrous material. Brown rot fungi break down the cellulose and leave the lignin behind, creating a brown, crumbly texture. Without these lignin-degrading fungi, fallen trees would persist in forests for centuries or longer, essentially unchanged. Dead wood would accumulate endlessly. Picture a forest without decomposers. Dead leaves would pile up year after year, creating an impenetrable mat on the forest floor. Fallen trees would lie unchanged, blocking light and taking up space. Nutrients would be locked away in all this unchanging material, unavailable to living plants. The forest would slowly become a cemetery of its own materials, unable to recycle and renew itself. But because fungi are there, constantly working, that doesn't happen. The forest is a place of continuous renewal, where what was becomes what will be, and fungi are the mediators of that transformation. Some fungi are parasites, living off other organisms and sometimes harming them in the process. There are fungi that infect plants, causing diseases in crops and wild plants alike. Rusts and smuts are common fungal diseases in agriculture, costing farmers billions of dollars every year. Some fungi infect insects, taking over their bodies and even controlling their behavior, turning them into spore-dispersing vehicles. The infamous zombie ant fungus from tropical rainforests is a perfect example, taking control of an ant's movements and directing it to climb to a specific height before releasing its spores. Even though parasitism might sound negative, it plays an important role in ecosystems. Parasitic fungi help control populations, prevent any one species from becoming too dominant, and contribute to the balance of nature. They're part of the checks and balances that keep ecosystems healthy and diverse. Then there are the symbionts, fungi that form partnerships with other organisms. This is where things get truly beautiful and fascinating. Many fungi form relationships with plant roots in structures called mycorrhizae, which literally means fungus root. In these partnerships, the fungus wraps around or even grows inside the plant's roots, extending far out into the soil with its mycelial network. The plant supplies the fungus with sugars made through photosynthesis. In return, the fungus provides the plant with water and nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, that it has scavenged from a much larger area of soil than the plant's roots could ever reach alone. About 90% of all land plants have mycorrhizal partners. That includes trees, grasses, flowers, crops. These partnerships are ancient, dating back to when plants first colonized land over 400 million years ago. Some scientists believe that mycorrhizal relationships were essential for plants to make the transition from water to land in the first place. Without fungal partners to help them access nutrients from primitive soils, those early plants might never have survived. Some plants have become so dependent on their fungal partners that they can't survive without them. Orchids, for example, have tiny seeds with no stored food reserves. When an orchid seed germinates, it relies entirely on a mycorrhizal fungus to provide nutrients until the seedling can photosynthesize on its own. No fungus, no orchid. It's a partnership written into the very survival of the species. Fungi also build in a sense. When mycelium spreads through soil, it helps hold the soil together. The network of hyphae creates structure, reducing erosion and helping water infiltrate into the ground rather than running off the surface. In forests, fungal mycelia contribute to what we call soil aggregation, the clumping of soil particles that creates air pockets and improves soil health. Healthy soil is full of fungi. When soil is damaged by tilling or pollution or overuse, the fungal networks are destroyed and the soil structure begins to collapse. Fungi are also part of something even more profound. They connect. They link plant to plant, tree to tree, creating underground networks that we're only beginning to understand. But we'll come back to that idea soon, because it deserves its own space in our story. For now, let's just appreciate the sheer versatility of fungi. They're decomposers, partners, parasites, and architects of the soil itself. They've been at this for hundreds of millions of years, quietly shaping the world in ways we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. Fungi are old, very old. The fossil record suggests that fungi have been on Earth for at least 400 million years, possibly much longer. Some estimates, based on molecular clock studies, push their origins back over 1 billion years, when life was still mostly aquatic and the land was barren. The earliest fungi were likely aquatic, living in the water and possessing flagella, tiny whip-like tails that allowed them to swim. Over time, as life began to colonize land, fungi made the transition too. They lost their flagella, adapted to the drier conditions, and began forming partnerships with the early plants that were also struggling to survive on land. By the time we reached the Devonian period, about 400 million years ago, fungi were well established on land. The fossil record from this time is fascinating. Preserved in rocks called the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, scientists have found beautifully preserved fungal structures, captured in such detail that you can see individual hyphae and spores. These fossils show us that fungi already had many of the features they have today: hyphae, mycelia, and the ability to form partnerships with plants. But the Devonian period also gave us something truly strange and wonderful. Something that, for over a century, baffled scientists and sparked debates. Its name is Prototaxites, and it was, quite possibly, the largest organism on land at the time. Imagine walking through a Devonian landscape. The plants are small, barely more than stems with no leaves or roots, most standing just a couple of feet tall. The land is mostly barren, rocky, dotted with shallow pools and marshes. And rising above this sparse landscape, you see tall, cylindrical structures. They look almost like tree trunks, but they're not trees. They stand up to 8 meters tall, nearly 26 feet, and are about 1 meter wide. They have no branches, no leaves, no obvious way of photosynthesizing. They're just there, towering over everything else. These were Prototaxites. For the longest time, no one could figure out what they were. When the first fossils were discovered in 1843, scientists thought they might be ancient conifer trees. But as more specimens were studied, that explanation didn't hold up. They lacked the cellular structure of wood. They didn't have growth rings or vascular tissues. So, maybe they were algae, some suggested, or lichens, which are themselves partnerships between fungi and algae. The debate continued for decades. Some researchers insisted they were plants, others argued for algae. A few voices suggested they might be fungi, but that seemed absurd. 20-foot-tall fungi. It didn't make sense. But in 2007, a team of researchers finally found compelling evidence. They analyzed the carbon isotopes in Prototaxites fossils and compared them to plants from the same time period. Plants, which get their carbon from the air through photosynthesis, have a fairly consistent carbon isotope ratio. But Prototaxites showed a much wider variation, suggesting it wasn't photosynthesizing at all. Instead, it was likely consuming a variety of organic materials, just like fungi do. The internal structure of the fossils also showed networks of tubes that resembled fungal hyphae, though with some unusual branching patterns. The verdict is still not entirely settled. Some scientists now believe Prototaxites might represent an entirely extinct lineage of life, something that doesn't fit neatly into any modern category. But the evidence strongly suggests it was fungal in nature, or at least fungus-like. Either way, it's a reminder that the history of life on Earth includes some truly bizarre chapters. Prototaxites lived from about 420 million to 350 million years ago. During that time, it would have been the tallest thing around, an eerie, trunk-like presence in an otherwise low-lying landscape. What role did it play? How did it grow so tall? What did it feed on? These are questions we may never fully answer. But the existence of Prototaxites tells us that the early land was shaped by organisms we can barely imagine today. As time went on, fungi diversified. New groups evolved, adapted to new environments, and formed new partnerships. By the time forests appeared, with their tall trees and rich ecosystems, fungi were already deeply integrated into the web of life. They were in the soil, in the wood, on the leaves, inside the roots. They were everywhere, doing the work that allowed those forests to thrive. Today, fungi continue to evolve, just as they have for hundreds of millions of years. New species are discovered regularly, and we're still learning about the many ways they interact with other organisms and their environments. But that ancient lineage, stretching back through deep time, reminds us that fungi are survivors, adapters, and essential partners in the story of life on Earth. The life cycle of a fungus is a journey that begins with something almost impossibly small and ends, if conditions are right, with the familiar mushroom shape we recognize. Let's walk through that journey, step by step, and appreciate the quiet elegance of fungal growth. It all starts with a spore. Spores are tiny, often microscopic, and incredibly numerous. A single mushroom can produce millions, even billions of spores. To put that in perspective, a large puffball mushroom might release 7 trillion spores. 7 trillion. That's 1,000 times the number of humans who have ever lived. Of course, the vast majority of those spores will never find a place to grow. They're sacrifices to probability, scattered on the wind, in the hope that a few, just a tiny fraction, will land somewhere suitable. They're released into the air, carried by wind or water or animals, and scattered across the landscape. Some spores are sticky, designed to cling to the fur or feathers of animals who brush against the mushroom. Others are lightweight, designed to float on air currents, traveling miles from their parent fungus. Some are forcibly ejected from the mushroom, shot into the air with tiny catapult-like mechanisms at the cellular level. Others simply fall and are carried away by passing breezes or raindrops. Most spores will never find a suitable place to grow. They'll land on concrete, in water, in places too hot or too cold or too dry. They'll be eaten by insects or decomposed by bacteria. They'll simply fade away, never germinating, their potential unrealized. But some will land in just the right spot. A patch of damp soil, a piece of rotting wood, a forest floor rich with fallen leaves and organic matter. And when a spore does find that right spot, something wonderful begins. When a spore lands in a favorable location, it waits. It might wait for hours or days, sometimes even months or years, until conditions are just right. The spore needs moisture, the right temperature, sometimes specific chemical signals from its environment. When those conditions align, the spore germinates. The outer wall, which has protected the genetic material inside, softens. A tiny filament begins to emerge, no bigger than a hair's breadth, pushing out into the world. This is the beginning of a hypha, the fundamental building block of the fungus. The hypha grows at its tip, a process driven by the delivery of materials to the growing point. Inside the hyphal tip, vesicles containing cell wall components are transported forward and fuse with the membrane at the very end, extending the hypha forward, molecule by molecule. It's growth in slow motion from our perspective, but from the fungus's perspective, it's a constant forward push, a persistent exploration of the environment. The hypha extends and branches as it searches for nutrients. When it encounters a source of food, a piece of dead leaf or a bit of organic matter in the soil, it responds. It secretes enzymes, breaking down whatever organic material is available, and absorbs the resulting nutrients through its cell walls. The nutrients fuel more growth, and the single hypha becomes 2, then 4, then dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions, all branching and interlacing, forming a network. As the hyphae continue to grow and branch, they form a network, the mycelium. This mycelial network can spread over large areas, sometimes covering square meters or even hectares of ground. It's a living web, constantly growing, exploring, responding to the environment. The mycelium is resilient. If part of it is damaged, it can regrow from other parts. If it finds a rich source of nutrients, it can grow rapidly in that direction. The mycelium is also patient. It can exist in this vegetative state for years, even decades, growing slowly, feeding quietly, never producing a mushroom. But when conditions are just right, when there's enough moisture and the temperature is within the right range, something changes. The mycelium shifts from the vegetative phase to the reproductive phase. It begins to form a fruiting body. Hyphae come together, compacting and organizing into specialized structures. In a matter of days, sometimes even hours, a mushroom emerges. It's a remarkable transformation. What was an invisible network underground suddenly produces a visible structure above ground. The mushroom's job is simple. It's there to produce and release spores. As the mushroom matures, specialized cells in its gills or pores undergo a process called meiosis, creating haploid spores with half the genetic material of the parent. These spores are then released, carried away on the breeze, and the cycle begins again. It's worth pausing here to think about what the mushroom actually represents. We often think of the mushroom as the fungus itself, but that's not quite right. The mushroom is more like a flower or a fruit. It's a temporary reproductive structure produced by the larger organism, the mycelium, which remains hidden below ground or inside wood. Some mycelia produce mushrooms every year under the right conditions. Others produce them rarely. And some fungi never produce what we'd recognize as a mushroom at all. They reproduce through spores released from microscopic structures or by fragmenting their mycelium. This hidden nature of fungi is part of what makes them so mysterious. We see the mushroom, the visible tip of the organism, and we often miss the vast, intricate network beneath. It's like seeing only the blossoms of a tree and not realizing there's a whole trunk and root system supporting them. The growth of fungi is also remarkably efficient. A mycelium can grow extremely fast under the right conditions. Some measurements have shown that a fungal network can extend by up to 1 kilometer in just 24 hours. That's an extraordinary rate of growth for an organism that doesn't move in the way we think of. Movement. It's growth by expansion, by constant tip growth and branching, creating ever more surface area to absorb nutrients. Fungi also have an amazing ability to sense and respond to their environment. They can grow towards sources of nutrients, away from toxic substances, and even respond to chemical signals from potential partners like plant roots. The mycelium isn't just a passive network. It's actively exploring, sensing, and adapting. When you see a mushroom in the forest, try to imagine the mycelium beneath it. Picture the threads spreading through the soil, wrapping around roots, penetrating wood, forming a living network that connects to other parts of the ecosystem. That mushroom is just the beginning of a much larger, much more complex story happening beneath your feet. Here's where our story takes a turn towards something that sounds almost like science fiction, but is very much science fact. Beneath the forest floor, trees are connected to each other through vast networks of fungal mycelium. These networks, sometimes called the wood wide web, allow trees to share resources, send signals, and support each other in ways that are only now beginning to be understood. Let's set the scene. Imagine a forest, not a plantation where trees are planted in rows, all the same age and species, but a natural forest with trees of different species, different ages, different sizes. There are towering old trees with roots sunk deep into the soil. There are younger trees, saplings trying to grow in the shade of their elders. There are shrubs and ferns and mosses carpeting the ground. Now, imagine if we could see beneath the soil. What we'd find is a vast, interconnected web of fungal hyphae wrapping around roots, growing through the soil, linking tree to tree, plant to plant. In some places, the density of fungal hyphae in soil is astounding. A single teaspoon of forest soil might contain several miles of fungal threads, all living, all growing, all part of the hidden infrastructure of the forest. These are mycorrhizal fungi, and they're forming partnerships with nearly every tree in the forest. The mycorrhizal relationship works like this. The fungus wraps around or penetrates the tiny root tips of a tree, forming a structure that's part root and part fungus. In ectomycorrhizal relationships, common with trees like pines, oaks, and birches, the fungus forms a sheath around the root tip and grows between the root cells, creating a network called the Hartig net. This structure increases the surface area for nutrient exchange by many times over. In arbuscular mycorrhizal relationships, more common with maples and many other trees, the fungus actually penetrates into the root cells themselves, forming tree-like structures called arbuscules inside the cells. The tree provides the fungus with sugars, made through photosynthesis in the tree's leaves. Up in the canopy, leaves are capturing sunlight and carbon dioxide, turning them into sugars, the magic of photosynthesis. Some of those sugars travel down through the tree, into the roots, and are delivered to the fungal partner. These sugars are rich in carbon, which the fungus needs to grow and maintain its sprawling mycelial network. In some cases, trees transfer up to 30% of the carbon they capture through photosynthesis to their fungal partners. That's an enormous investment, a significant portion of the tree's energy budget. In exchange, the fungus provides the tree with nutrients, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, that it has scavenged from a large area of soil with its sprawling mycelial network. The fungal hyphae can extend far beyond where the tree's roots reach, exploring crevices in rocks, penetrating tiny pores in the soil, accessing nutrients that would otherwise be unavailable. The fungus produces enzymes that can break down organic matter and release nutrients, and it can even dissolve minerals from rocks. It's like the tree has extended its root system by partnering with an organism that specializes in nutrient acquisition. The fungus also helps the tree absorb water, especially during dry periods. The fine threads of the mycelium can access water in small pores in the soil where roots can't reach, and they can transport that water to the tree. During droughts, trees with healthy mycorrhizal relationships often fare better than trees without them, a fact that's become increasingly important as climate patterns change and droughts become more common in many regions. But here's where it gets really interesting. A single mycorrhizal fungus can connect with the roots of multiple trees. One fungal individual might link 10, 20, or even more trees together, and each tree is connected to multiple fungi. The result is a complex, overlapping network, a web of connections that spans the entire forest floor. Through these fungal connections, trees can share resources. A large, mature tree, with its deep roots and access to more sunlight, might send sugars through the fungal network to a struggling sapling growing in the shade. The The sapling, unable to photosynthesize enough to meet its needs, survives on this shared carbon. It's not a one-way street either. The sapling might provide other benefits or simply represent an investment in the future. If the sapling survives, it may one day become a large tree itself, contributing to the network. Researchers have documented this sharing of carbon between trees. In one study, scientists traced radioactive carbon from a large birch tree through the mycorrhizal network to a nearby Douglas fir seedling. The carbon was transferred through the fungi, moving from the photosynthesizing birch to the shadowed fir, helping the younger tree survive. Some trees seem to act as hubs in the network. These are usually older, larger trees with the most extensive root systems and the most mycorrhizal connections. They're sometimes called mother trees because they appear to play a nurturing role, supporting younger trees through the network. When a mother tree is removed, the surrounding younger trees often struggle more than they would if a random tree were removed, suggesting that these hubs are important to the health of the forest community. But it's not just about carbon. Trees can also send chemical signals through the mycorrhizal network. When a tree is attacked by insects or infected by a disease, it can produce chemical defense compounds in its leaves and bark. But some trees also send signals through the fungal network, warning neighboring trees of the threat. The neighboring trees, receiving this chemical alarm, begin producing their own defense compounds, even before they've been attacked. It's a form of communication, mediated by fungi, that allows trees to prepare for danger. This idea of trees talking to each other, warning each other, sharing resources, has captured the public imagination. It's been popularized in books and documentaries, and it's often presented as a kind of forest-wide altruism, trees looking out for each other through their fungal partners. But as with many scientific ideas that enter popular culture, the truth is more complicated. Some researchers have pointed out that much of the evidence for resource sharing and communication through mycorrhizal networks is still being debated. The amounts of carbon transferred between trees are sometimes quite small, and it's not always clear whether the transfers are significant enough to actually help the receiving tree. The fungi themselves are the ones in control of the transfers, and they might be acting in their own self-interest rather than altruistically helping trees. It's also important to note that not all fungi form these cooperative mycorrhizal relationships. Some fungi are more exploitative, taking more from the plant than they give back. And some plants, called mycoheterotrophs, have given up on photosynthesis altogether and parasitize the mycorrhizal network, stealing carbon from nearby trees through their fungal connections. So, while the wood wide web is real, and the connections between trees through fungi are well documented, the narrative of forests as cooperative communities needs to be taken with a grain of caution. Nature is complex. There's cooperation, but there's also competition and exploitation. The mycorrhizal network is a place where all of these interactions happen simultaneously. Still, even with those caveats, the idea of an underground fungal network connecting trees is profoundly beautiful. It changes how we think about forests. They're not just collections of individual trees competing for resources. They're communities, interconnected and interdependent, with fungi playing the role of mediators, facilitators, and sometimes manipulators. The next time you walk through a forest, think about what's beneath your feet. An entire hidden world, a network of threads thinner than hair, connecting trees in ways we're not only beginning to understand. It's a reminder that the most important parts of an ecosystem are often the ones we can't see. Fungi don't just exist in forests and on fallen logs. They're deeply woven into human life too, in ways both ancient and modern. From the food we eat to the medicines we take, fungi have been our partners, sometimes without us even realizing it. Let's start with food. Fungi are responsible for some of humanity's most cherished culinary traditions. Bread, for example. The soft, fluffy texture of bread comes from yeast, a single-celled fungus that ferments sugars and produces carbon dioxide gas. Those bubbles of gas get trapped in the dough, causing it to rise. When you bite into a slice of fresh bread, that soft, airy texture, those tiny holes throughout the crumb, those are all the result of fungal fermentation. Humans have been using yeast to make bread for thousands of years, long before we understood what yeast actually was. Ancient Egyptians made leavened bread, and they considered the process almost magical, not understanding the living organisms that were transforming their dough. The discovery that yeast was actually a living organism didn't happen until the 19th century, when scientists finally observed yeast cells under microscopes and realized that fermentation was a biological process, not a purely chemical one. Before that, bakers knew that if they saved a bit of dough from one batch and added it to the next, the new batch would rise, but they didn't know why. They were unknowingly culturing and propagating yeast, passing living organisms from one generation of bread to the next. Cheese is another gift from fungi. Many cheeses rely on molds, specific species of fungi that are introduced during the cheese-making process. Blue cheeses like Roquefort and Gorgonzola get their distinctive flavor and appearance from Penicillium roqueforti, a blue-green mold that's allowed to grow throughout the cheese. The mold is intentionally introduced, either by adding it to the milk or by piercing the cheese with needles to allow air and mold spores to penetrate deep into the interior. As the mold grows, it produces enzymes that break down fats and proteins in the cheese, creating the strong, tangy flavors and the characteristic blue-green veins. Brie and camembert get their soft, creamy texture and white rinds from Penicillium camemberti. This mold grows on the surface of the cheese, forming a white, fuzzy coating that gradually breaks down the proteins in the cheese, making it softer and more flavorful as it ages. A young camembert is firm and mild. An aged one is soft, almost runny, and intensely flavorful, all thanks to the work of the fungus on its surface. Without fungi, the world of cheese would be far less interesting. There would be no blue cheese, no brie, no aged cheddars with their complex flavors developed through months of careful ripening with the help of beneficial molds. Even cheeses that don't have visible mold often rely on fungi at some stage of their production, either in the starter cultures or in the aging process. Beer and wine, too, owe their existence to fungi. Alcoholic fermentation, the process that turns sugars into alcohol, is carried out by yeast. Different strains of yeast produce different flavors and aromas, which is why beers and wines from different regions can taste so distinct. Winemakers and brewers have spent centuries cultivating specific yeast strains, selecting for flavors and aromas that make their products unique. Some breweries maintain yeast cultures that have been propagated continuously for decades or even centuries, guarding them as carefully as any secret recipe. The fermentation process itself is remarkable. Yeast cells consume sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts of their metabolism. In beer, the carbon dioxide is what creates the fizz and foam. In wine, it's usually allowed to escape during fermentation, though in champagne and sparkling wines, it's trapped in the bottle to create those delightful bubbles. The alcohol, of course, is what gives these beverages their intoxicating properties, but it's also what preserves them, preventing spoilage by other microorganisms. In many Asian cuisines, fungi play even more diverse roles. Soy sauce, miso, tempeh, and sake all rely on fungi for their production. A fungus called Aspergillus oryzae, known as koji in Japan, is used to ferment soybeans and rice, breaking down proteins and starches into compounds that give these foods their rich, savory flavors. The process of making soy sauce, for example, involves growing koji mold on soybeans and wheat, then fermenting the mixture in brine for months or even years. During that time, the enzymes produced by the fungus break down proteins into amino acids and starches into sugars, creating the complex, umami-rich flavor we associate with soy sauce. Tempeh, a traditional Indonesian food, is made by fermenting cooked soybeans with a fungus called Rhizopus oligosporus. The fungus grows throughout the soybeans, binding them together into a firm cake and transforming the bland beans into something with a nutty, mushroomy flavor. The fermentation also makes the proteins and nutrients in the soybeans more digestible and bioavailable. It's a tradition that goes back centuries, and it's based entirely on our partnership with fungi. Then there are the mushrooms we eat directly. Button mushrooms, portobellos, shiitakes, oyster mushrooms, chanterelles, morels, the list goes on. These are the fruiting bodies of fungi, cultivated or foraged, and they've been part of human diets for millennia. Mushrooms are nutritious, high in protein, vitamins and minerals, and they add a unique umami flavor to dishes. But fungi have given us more than just food. They've also given us some of our most important medicines. The most famous example is penicillin, the first widely used antibiotic. In 1928, a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold growing on one of his bacterial cultures had created a zone where bacteria couldn't grow. That mold was Penicillium notatum, and the compound it produced, which Fleming named penicillin, would go on to save millions of lives by treating bacterial infections. Penicillin opened the door to an entire era of antibiotic discovery. Many antibiotics used today are derived from fungi or bacteria. Fungi produce these compounds naturally as a way to compete with other microorganisms in their environment. We've simply learned to harness those compounds for our own purposes. Fungi have also contributed to medicine in other ways. Cyclosporin, an immunosuppressant drug used to prevent organ rejection in transplant patients, was originally derived from a soil fungus. Statins, which are used to lower cholesterol, were first discovered in fungi. Even some anti-cancer drugs have been developed from compounds found in fungi. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in the potential medicinal properties of fungi. Researchers are studying fungi for their antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and immune-boosting compounds. Some traditional medicines have long used fungi, and modern science is now catching up, trying to understand what makes these fungi effective. Beyond food and medicine, fungi are being explored for all sorts of modern applications. Mycelium, the network of fungal threads, can be grown into specific shapes and used as a biodegradable material for packaging, insulation, and even furniture. Companies are experimenting with growing mycelium into bricks for construction or into leather-like materials for fashion. Fungi are also being used in environmental cleanup, a process called mycoremediation. Certain fungi can break down pollutants like petroleum, pesticides, and heavy metals, helping to decontaminate polluted soils and water. They do this by producing enzymes that can break down toxic compounds into less harmful substances, or by absorbing and concentrating heavy metals in their tissues, which can then be removed. There's even research into using fungi to break down plastics. While most plastics are incredibly resistant to decomposition, some fungi have been found that can slowly break down certain types of plastic, offering a potential tool for dealing with the growing problem of plastic waste. Fungi are also being studied for their role in sustainable agriculture. Mycorrhizal inoculants, products containing beneficial fungi, can be added to soil to help plants grow better, absorb more nutrients, and resist stress. This could reduce the need for chemical fertilizers and improve crop yields in a more sustainable way. So, when we talk about fungi, we're not just talking about something out there in the forest. We're talking about partners in our daily lives, organisms that have fed us, healed us, and are now offering solutions to some of our modern challenges. They're ancient, but they're also part of our future. If you've ever gone mushroom hunting, or even just wandered through a forest with your eyes open, you've probably noticed that mushrooms come in an astonishing variety of shapes, sizes, and colors. Some are the classic umbrella shape with a cap and stem. Others are bizarre, barely recognizable as mushrooms at all. Let's take a gentle stroll through some of the more unusual and beautiful forms fungi can take. First, there's color. Mushrooms can be white, brown, yellow, orange, red, purple, blue, green, even black. Some are so brightly colored, they look almost unreal. The fly agaric, with its bright red cap dotted with white spots, looks like it belongs in a fairy tale. And in fact, it probably inspired many of those fairy tale illustrations. This is the classic toadstool, the mushroom that appears in storybooks and cartoons, though it's worth noting that it's toxic if eaten. Then there are mushrooms that glow in the dark. Yes, truly glow, producing their own light through a chemical reaction called bioluminescence. There are over 100 species of bioluminescent fungi known to science, and they produce an eerie green glow in the darkness of the forest. One of the most famous is the ghost fungus, Omphalotus nidiformis, found in Australia. It grows on dead or damaged trees, and in the dark, its gills emit a ghostly greenish light. The glow is faint, requiring complete darkness and dark-adapted eyes to see clearly. Early explorers and settlers reported being startled by these glowing fungi in the night, sometimes thinking they were seeing spirits or supernatural lights. Imagine walking through an Australian eucalyptus forest at night, far from any artificial lights. Your eyes adjust to the darkness, and suddenly you notice a soft green glow coming from the base of a tree. As you approach, you see the source, a cluster of mushrooms, their undersides glowing like tiny lanterns. Another bioluminescent mushroom is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, found in North America and Europe. These bright orange mushrooms grow in clusters on dead wood, and at night, their gills glow with a faint green light. The name is perfect. They look like little natural lanterns in the forest. The glow is strongest a few hours after sunset and fades as the mushroom ages. Fresh mushrooms glow more brightly than old ones. Perhaps the most spectacular display comes from Mycena chlorophyll and related species, small mushrooms found in Asian and Australian rainforests. These tiny fungi, growing in clusters on fallen logs, create concentrations of light bright enough to read by if you gather enough of them. In some tropical forests, entire logs can be covered in these glowing mushrooms, creating an otherworldly scene. Why do some mushrooms glow? Scientists aren't entirely sure, but the leading theory is that the light attracts insects. The insects land on the glowing mushroom, pick up spores on their bodies, and then carry those spores to new locations, helping the fungus reproduce. It's similar to how flowers use bright colors to attract pollinators, except in this case, the attraction happens at night and uses light instead of color. The chemical reaction that produces the glow involves a compound called luciferin and an enzyme called luciferase. the same basic chemistry used by fireflies and some marine organisms. When luciferin reacts with oxygen in the presence of luciferase, it produces light. In fungi, this reaction occurs in the mycelium or in specific parts of the mushroom, like the gills or the stem. Some bioluminescent fungi glow constantly, while others only glow at certain times or under certain conditions. The intensity of the glow can vary too. Some emit just a faint shimmer, barely visible even in complete darkness, while others are bright enough that you could, in theory, read by their light if you had enough of them. Now let's talk about shapes. Not all mushrooms have the classic cap and stem. Some have forms that seem designed by an artist with a vivid imagination. Shapes that make you pause and wonder how evolution arrived at something so unusual. Lion's mane mushrooms, for example, look more like a waterfall of icicles than a mushroom. They grow on trees, typically hardwoods like oak, beech, and maple, forming cascading masses of white, shaggy spines that can grow to the size of a basketball or larger. They look soft and delicate, almost like a fuzzy beard hanging from the tree, which is why they're sometimes called the bearded tooth mushroom. When you see one in the forest, it's startling. It doesn't look like what you expect a fungus to look like. It looks more like something from an underwater scene, a sea anemone attached to a tree trunk. Run your hand over it, and the spines are indeed soft, though the fungus itself is firm. They're also edible, and have a texture similar to seafood, often described as reminiscent of crab or lobster, making them a favorite among foragers and chefs. Coral fungi look exactly like underwater coral, with branching, finger-like structures that can be white, yellow, orange, or even purple. They grow upright from the ground, forming intricate reef-like shapes that can range from a few inches to over a foot tall. There are dozens of species of coral fungi, each with its own branching pattern and color. Some branch repeatedly like tiny trees. Others grow in simple, upright fingers. They're a delight to find because they're so visually striking. When you come across a patch of yellow coral fungus growing from the forest floor, it looks almost like someone has planted a tiny underwater garden in the middle of the woods. Earth stars are another fascinating form. These fungi start as round balls sitting on the forest floor, but as they mature, the outer layer splits and peels back in a star-like pattern, revealing a central ball that contains spores. The star-shaped base can have anywhere from 4 to many points. The whole structure sits elegantly on the ground like a piece of natural sculpture. When raindrops hit the central ball, or when something presses on it, puffs of spores are released into the air like smoke. It's a clever dispersal mechanism wrapped in a beautiful, symmetrical package. Earth stars are hygroscopic, meaning they respond to moisture. In dry conditions, the points of the star curl inward, protecting the spore sac. When moisture returns, they open up again, ready to release spores when conditions are favorable. Puffballs are round, sometimes egg-shaped, and when mature, they're filled with millions of spores in a powdery mass. If you press on a mature puffball, it releases a cloud of spores, like a little puff of smoke rising into the air. Kids love to stomp on puffballs and watch the spore cloud erupt, though mycologists would prefer you leave them alone so they can complete their reproductive cycle naturally. Some puffballs are tiny, barely bigger than a marble. Others, like the giant puffball, can grow as large as a basketball or even bigger. A large, mature giant puffball can contain trillions of spores, an almost incomprehensible number of potential new fungi. Shelf fungi, also called bracket fungi, grow horizontally from tree trunks, looking like shelves or steps growing out of the wood. They can be quite large, with some species forming brackets a foot or more across, and they can occur in stacks, one above another, creating a staircase effect on the trunk of a tree. These fungi are often very tough and woody, with textures ranging from cork-like to almost as hard as wood itself. They play an important role in breaking down trees, particularly ones that are no longer living or are in decline. Some shelf fungi are annual, producing a new fruiting body each year. Others are perennial, adding a new layer of growth each year like tree rings. If you cut through an old bracket fungus, you can often see the layers, marking years of growth. Bird's nest fungi are among the most charming and miniature. They're tiny, just a few millimeters across, and they look exactly like little birds' nests, complete with eggs. The nest is cup-shaped, and inside are small, round structures called peridioles that look just like tiny eggs. When a raindrop hits the nest with enough force, the peridioles are splashed out, sometimes landing several feet away. It's a brilliant adaptation for spore dispersal. The peridioles are slightly sticky on the outside, so they adhere to whatever they land on, whether it's a twig, a leaf, or a blade of grass. Over time, the peridiole breaks down and releases its spores in the new location. Stinkhorns are perhaps the most notorious for their unusual appearance and smell. They have phallic shapes and emit a foul odor, like rotting meat, which attracts flies. The flies land on the mushroom's slimy cap, which is covered in spores, and then carry those spores away on their bodies. It's an effective, if somewhat off-putting, strategy for spore dispersal. And then there are the jelly fungi, which have gelatinous, translucent textures. They can be ear-shaped, brain-like, or amorphous blobs of clear or colored jelly. They're often found on dead wood, especially after rain, and they have a unique, bouncy texture that's unlike any other type of mushroom. All of these strange and beautiful forms are solutions to the same problem: how to produce and disperse spores effectively. Different fungi have evolved different strategies, resulting in the incredible diversity of shapes, colors, and behaviors we see today. Each one is a little work of art, shaped by millions of years of evolution. Not all mushrooms are friendly. While many are edible and delicious, some are highly toxic, capable of causing serious illness or even ending a life. It's one of the most important things to understand about fungi. They have evolved chemical defenses, compounds that protect them from being eaten by animals, and some of these compounds can be harmful to humans. The chemistry of poisonous mushrooms is fascinating. These fungi produce toxins, complex molecules that can interfere with our body's normal functions. Some toxins attack the liver, others affect the kidneys, the nervous system, or the digestive tract. A few are so potent that even a small amount can be dangerous. One of the most infamous poisonous mushrooms is the destroying angel, Amanita virosa. It's a beautiful mushroom, pure white, elegant, growing in forests across North America and Europe. But eating it can be extremely harmful. The destroying angel contains amatoxins, compounds that interfere with the production of proteins in cells, particularly in the liver and kidneys. What makes amatoxins particularly dangerous is the delay. After eating a destroying angel, you might feel fine for several hours, even a day. Then the symptoms begin: nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain. By the time these symptoms appear, the toxins have already done significant damage. The liver begins to fail. Without medical intervention, the outcome can be tragic. The death cap, Amanita phalloides, is another member of the Amanita family and is considered one of the most toxic mushrooms on Earth. It looks fairly nondescript, with a greenish or olive-colored cap, but it contains the same amatoxins as the destroying angel. It's responsible for the majority of serious mushroom-related medical emergencies around the world. A single mushroom can contain enough toxin to be life-threatening. Interestingly, the death cap doesn't taste particularly bad. Some people have described it as fairly pleasant, which makes it even more dangerous because there's no immediate warning signal when you bite into it. By the time your body reacts, it's too late to prevent the toxin from being absorbed. Why do these mushrooms produce such potent toxins? From an evolutionary perspective, it's about defense. Mushrooms are the reproductive structures of fungi, and fungi have invested a lot of energy into producing them. The last thing they want is for an animal to come along and eat the mushroom before it has a chance to release its spores. By producing toxins, the fungus protects its investment. Some mushrooms contain toxins that aren't immediately life-threatening, but can cause severe gastrointestinal distress. The jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which we mentioned earlier for its bioluminescence, is also toxic. Eating it will cause intense nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, though it's not typically life-threatening. It's often mistaken for chanterelles, an edible mushroom that looks similar, which is why it's responsible for a fair number of accidental ingestions each year. Then there are mushrooms that affect the nervous system. Certain species of psilocybe contain psilocybin, a compound that affects serotonin receptors in the brain, causing altered perceptions and hallucinations. These mushrooms have been used in traditional ceremonies by various cultures for centuries, but their use is regulated or prohibited in many countries due to their psychoactive effects. Another group of mushrooms, the Amanita muscaria, commonly known as the fly agaric, contains compounds that affect the brain in different ways. Eating these mushrooms can cause confusion, agitation, and sometimes hallucinations, though the effects are unpredictable and can be unpleasant. Historically, they were used in some shamanistic practices, but they're not considered safe for consumption. There's also a mushroom called the deadly webcap, which contains a toxin that causes kidney failure, sometimes weeks after ingestion. The delayed onset of symptoms means that by the time the problem is recognized, irreversible damage may have already occurred. It's worth emphasizing that you should never, ever eat a wild mushroom, unless you are absolutely certain of its identification. And even then, you should be cautious. Mushroom identification can be tricky. Many edible mushrooms have poisonous lookalikes. The margin for error is small, and the consequences of a mistake can be severe. Professional mycologists, people who study fungi, spend years learning to identify mushrooms accurately. They use field guides, spore prints, microscopic examination, and sometimes even chemical tests to confirm identifications. If you're interested in foraging for wild mushrooms, the best approach is to learn from an expert. Join a local mycological society and start with species that are easy to identify and have no dangerous lookalikes. The existence of poisonous mushrooms is a reminder that nature isn't always gentle. Fungi, like all living things, are engaged in a struggle for survival. The toxins they produce are part of that struggle, chemical weapons in an ancient evolutionary arms race. Understanding and respecting that is part of appreciating fungi in all their complexity. Let's turn our attention now to something that's captured a lot of interest in recent years. The relationship between certain mushrooms and brain health. This is a topic where ancient traditional knowledge is meeting modern scientific research. And while we're still in the early stages of understanding, the findings are intriguing. One mushroom that's been getting a lot of attention is lion's mane, the same cascading, icicle-like mushroom we talked about earlier. For centuries, lion's mane has been used in traditional Chinese medicine, often as a tonic for overall health and vitality. But in recent decades, scientists have become interested in its potential effects on the brain and nervous system. Studies on lion's mane have found that it contains compounds called hericenones and erinacines. These compounds have been shown in laboratory and animal studies to stimulate the production of nerve growth factor, or NGF. NGF is a protein that plays a crucial role in the growth, maintenance, and survival of neurons, the cells that make up our nervous system and brain. Neurons need NGF to stay healthy, to form new connections with other neurons, and to repair themselves when damaged. The idea is that by promoting NGF production, lion's mane might help protect neurons from damage, support the growth of new neural connections, and potentially improve cognitive function. In laboratory studies, researchers have found that compounds from lion's mane can cause neurons to extend projections, the branches that connect one neuron to another. Using advanced microscopy, scientists observed that these compounds increase the size of growth cones, specialized structures at the tips of growing neurons that help them navigate and form connections. This has led researchers to investigate whether lion's mane could be beneficial for conditions like cognitive changes that sometimes occur with aging, memory concerns, and even more serious brain health matters. Some small human studies have been conducted. In one study from Japan, older adults with mild cognitive concerns were given lion's mane supplements for 16 weeks. The results suggested some improvement in cognitive test scores compared to a placebo group. The improvements were modest, but statistically significant, and they faded after supplementation was stopped, suggesting that ongoing consumption might be necessary for continued benefits. Another study looked at younger, healthy adults and found that a single dose of lion's mane improved reaction time on certain cognitive tasks, particularly those involving processing speed and attention. The participants performed faster on tests given 60 minutes after taking the supplement, though other aspects of cognitive function, like memory recall, weren't significantly affected in the short term. A different study examined the effects over 28 days in healthy young adults. The results showed a trend toward reduced feelings of stress, though the effect didn't quite reach statistical significance. Interestingly, were some tasks where performance actually decreased slightly compared to the placebo group, reminding us that supplements can have complex effects and that more research is needed to understand the full picture. However, it's important to note that the research is still limited. Most studies have been small, involving dozens of participants rather than hundreds or thousands. They've been short-term, lasting weeks or months rather than years. The results, while promising, need to be replicated in larger, longer studies before we can draw firm conclusions. The mechanisms by which lion's mane might affect the brain are still being worked out. Does it actually increase NGF levels in the human brain? Do the active compounds cross the barrier between the bloodstream and the brain tissue? How much of the supplement needs to be consumed to have an effect? What are the long-term effects of regular consumption? These are questions that researchers are actively exploring, and we don't have definitive answers yet. Beyond lion's mane, fungi have played an interesting role in neuroscience research more broadly. Yeast, a type of single-celled fungus, has been used extensively in scientific research to study basic cellular processes. Because yeast cells share many similarities with human cells at the molecular level, they're a useful model organism. Researchers studying aging, for example, have used yeast to understand how cells age and deteriorate over time, insights that might eventually apply to human aging and age-related conditions. Some fungi produce compounds that affect the nervous system, and these compounds have been studied not because they're beneficial, but because understanding how they work can teach us about brain chemistry. For example, certain fungi produce compounds that block specific receptors in the brain, and by studying these compounds, scientists have learned more about how those receptors function. There's also interest in other mushrooms for their potential health benefits. Reishi mushrooms have been studied for their immune-modulating effects. Cordyceps, a group of fungi that parasitizes insects, has been used in traditional medicine and is now being studied for its potential effects on energy and athletic performance. Turkey tail mushrooms, which grow on dead wood in colorful, fan-like layers, are being researched for their immune-supporting compounds. It's important to approach all of this with appropriate caution. Just because a mushroom has been used traditionally or shows promise in laboratory studies doesn't mean it's a proven medicine. The world of supplements and health products can be full of exaggerated claims. If you're interested in trying medicinal mushrooms, it's wise to look for products that have been tested for quality and purity, and to talk to a healthcare professional, especially if you have any health conditions or take other medications. But the fact that fungi might offer compounds that could support brain health and overall wellness is exciting. It's another example of the deep connection between fungi and other life forms, a connection that has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Fungi have shaped the environments we live in, the foods we eat, and now, potentially, they might help us understand and care for our own bodies and minds. The research is ongoing, and we're learning more all the time. Who knows what other secrets fungi might hold? What other compounds, what other potential benefits are waiting to be discovered in the vast and still largely unexplored kingdom of fungi? Before we conclude our journey, let's talk about one more way that fungi have contributed to human knowledge. Beyond their ecological roles and their direct uses in food and medicine, fungi have been invaluable as model organisms in scientific research. A model organism is a species that scientists study intensively in order to understand biological processes that are common across many forms of life. The idea is that by studying a relatively simple, easy-to-work-with organism, you can learn things that apply to more complex organisms, including humans. Yeast, particularly a species called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is one of the most important model organisms in all of biology. It's a single-celled fungus, easy to grow in the lab, and it reproduces quickly. But despite its simplicity, yeast shares many fundamental cellular processes with human cells. Yeast cells have a nucleus, they undergo cell division, they have mitochondria for energy production, and they respond to stress and environmental changes in ways that are similar to more complex cells. Because of these similarities, yeast has been used to study an astonishing range of topics. Researchers have used yeast to understand how cells regulate their growth and division, how they repair damaged components, and how they respond to nutrients and stress. Many of the basic principles of cell biology were worked out using yeast as a model. Yeast has also been crucial in aging research. Scientists can easily manipulate yeast genes and observe how those changes affect the lifespan and health of the cells. This has led to discoveries about the genetic and molecular factors that influence aging, discoveries that might eventually inform strategies to promote healthy aging in humans. In the field of genetics, yeast played a key role in developing our understanding of how genes work. The yeast genome was one of the first eukaryotic genomes to be fully sequenced, and that sequencing effort helped develop the techniques and approaches that would later be used to sequence the human genome. Yeast has even been used in neuroscience. Although yeast doesn't have a nervous system, it does have cellular processes related to protein folding and degradation, stress responses, and cell survival that are relevant to neurodegenerative conditions. By studying these processes in yeast, researchers can screen for potential drugs or identify genetic factors that might contribute to conditions affecting the human brain. Beyond yeast, other fungi have also served as model organisms. The bread mold, Neurospora crassa, was used in groundbreaking genetic research in the early and mid-20th century. Studies on Neurospora helped establish the concept that one gene codes for one enzyme, a fundamental principle of molecular biology. Researchers who worked with Neurospora went on to win Nobel Prizes for their contributions to genetics and biochemistry. Fungi have also been used to study how organisms sense and respond to their environments. The cellular machinery that allows a fungus to detect nutrients, respond to light, or coordinate growth is similar in many ways to sensory and signaling systems in more complex organisms. By studying these processes in fungi, scientists gain insights that are relevant across the tree of life, and fungi continue to be important in biotechnology. Yeast is used in the production of biofuels, industrial enzymes, and even pharmaceuticals. Genetic engineering techniques have allowed scientists to modify yeast so that it produces insulin, the hormone needed by people with certain health conditions. This was one of the first successes of recombinant technology, and it demonstrated the practical power of using fungi as biological factories. So when we think about fungi, we should remember that they've contributed not just to our understanding of ecology and biodiversity, but also to fundamental advances in biology, medicine, and technology. They're small, often hidden organisms, but they've had an outsized impact on human knowledge and progress. And so we come to the end of our journey through the world of mushrooms and fungi. We've wandered through ancient forests, explored underground networks, marveled at glowing mushrooms in the dark, and considered the many ways fungi touch our lives, from the bread we eat to the medicines that heal us. Fungi are everywhere, yet often unnoticed. They work quietly, breaking down what has passed, connecting what lives, and cycling nutrients through ecosystems. They're ancient survivors, lineages that stretch back hundreds of millions of years, through mass changes in life on Earth and dramatic shifts in climate and environment. They've partnered with plants since land was first colonized, helping forests grow, helping crops thrive, and helping ecosystems maintain their balance. They're also endlessly diverse and beautiful, from the towering prototaxites of the Devonian to the tiny glowing mushrooms of today's rainforests. From the sprawling mycelial networks beneath our feet to the delicate, lacy forms of coral fungi, they remind us that nature is full of surprises, full of forms and functions we're only beginning to understand. Every walk through a forest is an opportunity to encounter something unexpected, something that has been quietly doing its work for longer than we can imagine. Perhaps what's most remarkable about fungi is their interconnectedness. They link tree to tree, plant to plant. They connect past and present, breaking down what was and making it available for what will be. They connect us to the soil, to the forests, to the cycles of growth and renewal that sustain life on this planet. In a world that can sometimes feel fragmented and disconnected, fungi remind us that everything is linked, everything influences everything else, and we're all part of the same vast web of life. There's something deeply comforting about that interconnection. The idea that beneath every forest, threads of mycelium are linking trees together, allowing them to share resources and support each other. The knowledge that the old log we pass in the woods is being transformed, slowly and patiently, into nutrients that will feed new growth. The understanding that even the smallest organisms, working unseen and unappreciated, are essential to the functioning of the whole. As you settle into sleep tonight, you might think of those underground networks, spreading silently through the soil, carrying nutrients and chemical signals, connecting communities of trees in ways we're still learning to appreciate. You might imagine the quiet work of decomposition, fungi breaking down a fallen log, releasing nutrients, making space for new growth. The process takes months, years, decades, But it never stops, never hurries, simply continues at its own patient pace. Or you might simply rest in the knowledge that the world is more interconnected, more collaborative, and more wondrous than we often realize. That beneath every forest floor, there's a hidden world of threads and networks, a living web that has been weaving itself for millions of years and will continue long after we've closed our eyes. The mycelium doesn't sleep, doesn't rest in the way we do. It continues its slow, steady work, growing thread by thread, molecule by molecule, connecting and recycling and sustaining. Think of a forest at night. The trees stand silent, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The animals have settled into their nests and burrows. But beneath the soil, the fungal networks are active, always active, moving nutrients from here to there, responding to chemical signals, growing towards sources of food, supporting the seedlings that will become the forest of tomorrow. It's a continuous process, a cycle that has no beginning and no end, just an eternal present of growth and transformation. You have done enough today. You've learned, you've wondered, you've imagined. The mycelium beneath the forest floor doesn't hurry. It grows at its own pace, patient and persistent, adding one cell at a time, one connection at a time, building networks that span acres and last for centuries. You too can rest now, knowing that everything continues, everything is connected, and you are part of this vast, intricate web of life. Your rest is part of the cycle too, a time of restoration and renewal, just as important as the active hours. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts settle like spores, gently landing on soft soil. Let the quiet work of the world carry on without you for a while. The fungi will keep growing, the forests will keep breathing, and you can simply rest, held by the gentle knowledge that nature, in all its strange and beautiful forms, is always there, always working its quiet magic. Sleep well, dream softly, and may your rest be as peaceful as a forest at twilight, when the first glimmers of bioluminescent fungi begin to glow in the darkness. Tiny lights guiding the way through the ancient, patient, endlessly interconnected world of mushrooms and mycelium. Good night.